Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Blythe. I'm the director of the Rhodes Centre for International Economics and Finance here at Brown University. And I'm delighted today to bring you the last talk of our series for this current semester. And I'm delighted to have virtually, although next week we'll have lunch actually, but we're doing this virtually just now because it's the end of the semester and everyone's seriously busy. This is Dr. Professor Arie Krampf, who is the Associate Professor of Political Economy at, wait till I get the title right, the School of Government and Society at the Academic College of Tel Aviv-Yafo. He's currently visiting Harvard for a year, which is why he's in the neighborhood and we'll be able to have lunch next week. But he's interested in something I'm really interested in, and I know that many of you are interested in, which is this whole question of American monetary power. Right? Where does American monetary power come from? Is that really the essence of American power? Is it really the dollar rather than its military and other capabilities? And are we thinking about this the right way? And Arie has a great paper he's going to share with us on looking at the Clinton period in terms of the strong dollar doctrine and how that fits into our prevailing conceptions of monetary power. So looking forward to that beginning in a few moments. As usual, the housekeeping is as follows. If you're inside with us here at Brown, then you want to ask questions at the end, by all means do. You can just either raise your hand because there's probably going to be enough number that I can actually call on you, or if you'd rather do a Q&A, just drop it into the Q&A and we'll go from there. For those of you who are watching on YouTube, you know what to do. Just put your comments into the comments at the bottom of the live feed onto YouTube, and Hayden will pick those up and put them into our Q&A. So with that, I would like to invite Arie to tell us about the Clinton administration, the strong dollar doctrine, and what we don't get right about that version of the story. Welcome, Arie.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark, for the introduction and the invitation. I will take a moment to put my slides. Okay. So, you know, before I start talking on this topic, I would like to answer a question that I hear quite often. Why on earth I'm studying the case of the United States? After all, I'm a political economist of Israel. I study globalization of finance and central banking. But the United States is not my primary topic. The way I came to study this topic is basically about 10 years ago. I was interested in the consolidation of the low inflation consensus during the 90s. And already back then, I saw that most of the studies point to the usual suspects, the United States, Paul Volcker, Elliot Greenspan, the IMF. But in my research, I wasn't convinced that these are the real factors that that can explain, especially why the United States embraced the low inflation regime and converged towards it. The United States converged for the low inflation regime somewhere in the 90s, and it was associated with the strong dollar doctrine, clintonism, and the transition to neoliberalism. And as an outsider, as someone who comes from the perspective of international political economy rather than from the perspective of the American case, I was struck by the devastating economic and social impact of clintonism, which is obviously global repercussion. And I asked myself, what made those policymakers, the group, what I call the strong dollar coalition, made those decisions that had devastating socioeconomic consequences. I was not convinced by the explanation which put the focus on the power of Wall Street and the IMF, because I knew from other studies that governments can resist private interest when they really want to do so. And they certainly can not abide by professional economists. I found also the claim made by several scholars that the transition to neoliberalism in the United States was driven by the US hegemonic power. And I am not saying that this argument is wrong, but I sense that it is not sufficient. What was missing for me was the analysis that explain how the belief that the strong dollar was in American best interest was consolidated. And basically, in this research that I'm going to present today, this is the main question. I seek to provide an answer to these questions based on what I call an outside-in approach. I argue that the United States in the 90s adjusted its interest and its economic strategy to development that took place outside it, primarily in Europe. I'm going to argue that in the 90s, the United States did not go it alone. It wasn't the first mover, but rather it responded to development and processes that happened outside it. Okay, so let me start. What I will do, this is a work in progress. It is based on the previous article that I published on the topic, but given I'm currently working on it, so I will keep my presentation quite simple and present the general idea. I will start with stating the obvious things that most of you know. What is clintonism? What were the consequences and the costs? And then I will move to the more interesting part of the lecture about the causal explanation and the link to the US power or declining power. Okay, so some facts and things that you already know. Clintonism, as I see it, consists of 4 key elements if we want to consolidate it to the main pillars. And these are fiscal consolidation, which imply reduction of budget deficit and public debt, strong dollar policy, which implies tight monetary policy, high interest rates, and intervention in the foreign exchange markets. And in addition, financial liberalization during the 90s, and a specific type of trade policy, which include signing of NAFTA, accession of China to the World Trade Organization, and a quite aggressive negotiation strategy with Japan. Now, later on, I will also try to explain how all these trends connect together. Now, few chart here, we see the reduction of the budget deficit from 7% to basically 0, the reduction of the budget itself. Here we see the fall of the public debt, the control of the public debt. What we see here is the German effective exchange rate, the mark effective exchange rate during the 90s. So what we can see the strengthening of the mark in the first half of the 90s and the decline of the currency in the second half of the 90s. And here we see the effective exchange rate of the dollar during the same period. So we see the peak during the 80s, then due to the intervention in foreign exchange rate of the G7, we see the fall of the dollar. And then during the 90s, it was the G7 and the Federal Reserve put a floor under the dollar, and they managed to keep it, the exchange rates increasing. Now, one of the key elements in this story that we have to keep in mind is that during the late 80s and the early 90s, the United States faced a very significant policy problem, and this was the very low rate of saving within the United States. And this problem concerned both the Treasury and the Federal Reserve during this period. And the strong dollar policy, at least one of its purpose, was to address the low saving rate in the United States. The idea was that in order to promote domestic investment, the United States would have to attract foreign currency. And for that purpose, it would have to maintain its monetary leadership position. And what I'm arguing is that during the late 80s and early 90s, this position was threatened. And this was the source and the driver of the strong dollar policy. Now, going back to the story, the achievement of clintonism is quite clear. And now there was a relatively rapid growth rate. Asset prices went up. They were financed by a huge inflow of foreign investment. What you can see here is the amount of dollar invested in the American stock market, which grew 4 times during the period. Here we see the ratio of foreign investment to domestic credit during the 90s. Again, the ratio increased 4 times. And this led to a transformation of the US international investment position. The US transformed from a net creditor to a net debtor, and the debt was increased and increased. And again, I believe most of you know this story. The costs, the main cost of this policy was the industrialization of the American economy. Here we see a number of jobs in manufacturing in the United States, which dropped after 2000. And also the finding in the archives show that during the 90s, there was a lot of complaint of different industries that were impacted by the strong dollar policy as they faced more difficult terms, they face difficulty in exporting their product to Europe, Japan, and other markets. So far, as I said, things that we know. Now, the question is, what was the driver of Clinton's reform? Now, in very broad brush strokes, the literature, one of the dominant view in the literature is that Clintonism was driven by the American power. It was in American interest, and I call it the US hegemony hypothesis. And the US-American hypothesis assumes that Clinton reforms reflected the US interest. It was what the United States wanted. It was in order to execute those reforms, the US used its economic and monetary power, and it shifted the burden of adjustment to other countries. And this policy satisfied the interests of certain powerful groups within the United States, primarily the Wall Street, which was one of the drivers of this change, in addition to the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Now, this view is presented by various scholars like Arie, Susan Strange, Jonathan Kirshner, and David Harvey, and so on. It is a very dominant view. I will give you 2 quotes, one from Kirshner, who argue the second US post-war order, which I date from '94, as the foreign policy agenda of the Clinton administration took shape through 2007, was based on an anti-Keynesian economic philosophy, market fundamentalism, and it coincided with the emergence of unrivaled US unipolarity. David Harvey, make a quite similar argument, and he put the emphasis on the Wall Street, IMF, and Treasury complex. And he's talking about the fact that the United States persuade, cajole, coerce many developing countries to take the neoliberal road. Now, My problem with this hypothesis is that it is inconsistent with some finding that, for example, findings that are presented in the work of Henning Kendall regarding the attempts that the United States made during Bush presidency in the early 90s. The United States made a lot of effort to reject the very same policy that we later called neoliberalism. What Henning showed that in 91, the Nicholas Brady, the Treasury, tried to persuade the G7 countries to coordinate fiscal expansion. And as he described it, the United States, the table had turned on the United States. It only embittered the US-German relationship at a delicate moment. And when the Bundesbank tightened rather than eased monetary policy, it revealed the absence of any semblance of policy coordination within the G7. So the finding is that until 91, 92, the United States, the Treasury, the president wanted to reject the same principles that later Clinton embraced. And this is a puzzle. What happened that suddenly the United States changed its position, its interests, and the policy? My argument is that the Clintonism, all those four principles represent a process in which the United States basically internalized the burden of adjustment. And internalizing the burden of adjustment is a sign of declining power and not a sign of power. One of the scholars that I found in his work, the repercussion of this view, is Rawi Abdalal, and in his book he makes this very clear statement regarding the interest of the United States during this period, and regarding the dominant view among IPE scholars. And Abdalal writes, the most important misconception of conventional account concerned the role of the United States. Neither the US Treasury nor the Wall Street has preferred or promoted multilateral liberal rules for global finance. The US approach to globalization has been neither organized nor rule-based, but rather ad hoc. Now, Abdallah doesn't speak specifically on monetary policy, but I think this is part of the same package. The rules-based regime, the strong dollar, conservatism. The United States did not want it. So in a way, we can present, the field in which I am situating this article in the following way. We have the dominant view of the US hegemony hypothesis and other scholars, among which Rawi Abdalal, where I situate myself, which are want to re-examine this hypothesis, and I put on the table the US declining power hypothesis in order to explain the transition of the United States to neoliberalism. Okay, so now I would like to take a break from the historical story and say a few words about the concept of monetary power. Now, it will be only very few words. I do not have the time to expand on the topic, so really highlights. Okay, what I do based on my the reading of the different theories of monetary power, I came up with this classification, quite simple, I think useful, and I think that it makes sense. I distinguish between two types of monetary power. Monetary power as autonomy, which captures the capacity of the state to shift the burden of adjustment or to delay the burden of adjustment. This is the most conventional definition of monetary power. But and then there is also monetary power in terms of that capture the access of the country country to international liquidity. And those two types of monetary powers are not always correlated, and sometimes there is even a trade-off. And I think it is important to make this distinction because I think that the literature tends to overestimate the US capacity to shift the burden of adjustment. Now, then I make a distinction between the structural factors that determine a state monetary power and the institutional factors. Structural factors are those factors that are relatively stable and they cannot change very quickly in the short term. And institutional factors are those factors that can change in the short term. And therefore, the structural factors are quite good in order to explain stability, to explain the structure of the system. And the institutional factors are those factors that explain change. And they depend on historical, on contingent events. So I use this framework in order to analyze what happened in the 90s. And what I argue is that certain processes that took place in Europe increased the monetary power of Europe, and they caused the decline of the monetary power of the United States, financial liberalization in the European community, German unification, negotiation and signing of the Maastricht Treaty, and the consolidation, basically the de facto Mark bloc in the early 90s. All those factors made it more difficult for the United States to maintain its monetary leadership. Now, what are the indications of this claim? This is one of the indications. Here you see the Federal Reserve interest rate and the Bundesbank interest rate and the Bank of Japan interest rate. And what you can see that until the end of the 80s, the Federal Reserve rate was the highest, and this reflected its power, its capacity to attract foreign investment. And then in the early 90s, the Bundesbank went it alone, increased interest rate, and basically it shifted the burden of adjustment to the United States and to France, and they had to, we know it quite well regarding France, but there is no agreement regarding the process in the United States. What I argue is that the United States also had to adjust to the Bundesbank. This is the second indication. This is the pattern of net portfolio of foreign investment. And we can see here in this chart that in the early 90s, the United States, the capital inflow to the United States dropped. Japan attracted more capital investment and Germany attracted more capital investment. So to sum up what so far, I argue that in the early 90s, the monetary leadership of the United States was challenged, and therefore the United States responded by what we call neoliberalism, Clinton reforms, and it restored its monetary leadership in the second half of the 90s. Okay, so far the story. Now, how do I support my argument? I will present you 4 types of evidence, some better, some less convincing, but still contributing to my argument. The first type of evidence is the Fed's policy and the way they perceived the international arena during the early 90s. Now, this finding, I already presented them in my previous paper, but which now it becomes one element of a bigger argument that I want to make here. Now, I find it seems to me very interesting findings in the discussions of the Federal open market committee regarding the developments in Europe. What we see here is a quote from a discussion in the FOMAC in 1990. And the Federal Reserve observed, now just for the context, in the 90s, the United States entered a kind of the beginning of a recession, and the Fed was expected to lower interest rates. But the problem was that at that period, the Bundesbank went it alone, increased interest rates, refused to coordinate monetary policy. And the FOMAC described it as the box we are in with respect to the interaction between domestic interest rates, foreign interest rates, and the exchange rates. So what we see here, a formulation of the dilemma that the United States faced, whether to respond to external factors, to the monetary conservatives within the emerging Mark bloc, or to respond to domestic circumstances and lower the interest rate with the risk of losing capital inflow. A year later, they still make this type of observation. They look at the policies of other central banks, and what they say is that the other central bankers' reluctance to respond to rather low monetary growth, it does indicate that the tide among central banks internationally is still pretty conservative. Now, you know, we are talking about the Federal Reserve during Greenspan period. They look at the policies of the Bundesbank, Bank of France, and the Bank of Japan, and what they say, they are too conservative. They should reduce interest rate. So those quotes are important because they also shed light on the clash between Greenspan and the Treasury, and that Greenspan is known to be a conservative central banking, but what I argue is that part of his conservativeness can be explained by the fact that he wanted to maintain the international position of the dollar. Okay, as I said, those findings are already presented in the article published 3 years ago. Okay, the other finding that I think contribute, they are part of my story, is that we can identify two policy coalitions, the strong dollar policy coalition that we all know, Clinton, Greenspan, Larry Summers, and Bob Rubin, that they developed this belief in the need of a strong dollar. Here we see Greenspan claim and announce that he does not take into account the trade balance when he exercises monetary policy. It is not part of the response function of the Fed. Here, Rubin explained the logic, the link between the strong dollar and the budget and the fiscal consolidation. Okay, I think I can skip it, but the more interesting thing is that the strong dollar policy coalition had an opposition. We can call it the anti-strong dollar or the weak dollar coalition. It included people like Fred Bergsten, who was the head of the Institute for International Economics, and later he became the chairman of the Competitiveness Policy Council, initiated by the Republican Congressman John LeFals. And they tried to offer an alternative strategy to deal with the low saving. What they wanted to do is to increase the US competitiveness by a weaker dollar and address the low saving with policies that designed to enhance savings and also by increasing public investment. But those by the mid 90s, this policy coalition was gone, and the Competitive Policy Council was dismantled, I think, in 97. But I mention it because it's important for us to understand what was the context. You know, the strong dollar policy and the Competitive Policy Council were offered different solutions to the same problem, and the problem was the low saving, domestic investment, and the need to attract foreign financial flows. Another piece of finding, you know, another element in this story, which I find interesting, is that the way the strong dollar policy coalition perceived the United States within the global system. And what struck me is that they perceive the United States as a globalization laggard, as a globalization. They say, you know, the United States should not stay behind. So here Ruben is saying globalization is continuing, and countries around the world are entering into all kinds of trade liberalization agreements. The only question is, will we be inside it, or will we be outside it? Here, Greenspan is talking about the need for budget cut, and again, he mentioned the adverse consequences for financial markets and economic growth, which implies, again, I mean, those policymakers are talking about the United States as if it was a, you know, middle-sized country, a semi-peripheral country that has to worry about financial flows. And this is a sign of weakness. Now, obviously, you may say this is only rhetoric. This is also a possible explanation, but at least what I ask you is, you know, keep the option open that maybe this is not only ideological screen, and maybe they are really concerned by the incapacity of the United States to attract foreign investment. Now, the last part of the story, the response of the European countries. How Europe, how Germany, France responded to the strong dollar policy. Did they resist? Did they try to compete? Well, let's see. So at the beginning of the 90s, as I already argued, there was a clash between the United States and the other G7 members. The reason was all the other G7 members converged to the German model, especially, you know, primarily France, UK, and also Japan. This is what I show in the previous article. And basically, the United States became isolated within the G7. It was the only country that wanted to coordinate fiscal expansion. Given the fact that the United States was not able to persuade the other G7 countries to coordinate fiscal expansion, Bush had to renege on his election promise not to increase taxes. And Bush himself blamed Greenspan for that. I think Bush should have blamed Germany and the G7 countries, because Greenspan, according to my story, was only the messenger. He was the one, he responded to the conservative policies of other central bankers. Now, the interesting finding is that during Clinton administration, the Europeans, central bankers, primarily the Bundesbank, they were very happy to assist the United States to restore its monetary leadership position. So, you know, here you can see this is from 97, I think, and the headline is "Everyone wants a strong dollar." Everyone, it means Germany, France, Japan, you know, everybody wants to help the United States to become the leader. This is another headline from the Financial Times with a quote from Hans Tietmeyer, the president of the Bundesbank: "The dollar is back on its way upward. I always welcome it when the dollar finds its correct value. So, I was asking myself, in a way, the United States restore its position as monetary leader, but only with the help of its peers within the G7. Okay, let me conclude. So, given that this is a work in progress, I didn't feel I can really provide like a full conclusion because I still put the pieces together. But I will say a few words as a kind of to broaden the discussion. I think Clinton reform were a transformative moment in the United States economic history, not less, maybe more than the Reagan reform. The fact is that currently, I mean, in recent years, within the populist backlash in the United States, the populists leveled their criticism against the Clintons' legacy, not against Reagan legacy. And it was very interesting that Clinton's legacy, and particularly the strong dollar legacy, is attacked both by the right wing and the left wing. Both Elizabeth Warren in his what she called economic patriotism, and Trump under the heading of Make America Great Again, they attack the legacy of Clinton. Now, what I ask myself is, okay, so we have the strong dollar policy and we have the opposition. The opposition, you can find it in Trump, Warren, or in the Competitiveness Policy Council. It's all more or less the same approach. Now, you may ask yourself, which type of those policy represent the real US interests? Which type of policy represent the power of the United States? And what I would like to suggest to you here is that the clash between the two national economic projects, because I think we are talking about not about just policy, these are two completely national projects. The clash between them represents the weakening, the declining power of the United States, because it cannot keep them bridge between the need to respond to domestic needs and the need to maintain its international monetary leadership. And as time passes, it's going to be more and more difficult. And each decision, each choice would have huge sacrifices. Either the US would have to sacrifice the domestic economy in order to preserve its international position, or the other way around, if it would prioritize domestic production system, investment, etc., it would have to go back from economically from the international leadership role. Thank you. I will stop here.
That's great. Thank you very much. So we've got 20 minutes to have a chat about this and perhaps push the paper further along. For those who are in the room with us, if you want to ask a question, just put your hand up and I can see. In the meantime, I'm going to kick it off with my thoughts on this. So I like this. I buy this story, but I wonder if it's kind of just of a moment. It's really about this period. So I'm going to put it in a different context. So forget all the Helena, Kirchner, IPE stuff. Let's put Greta Krippner on one side, and Greta Krippner, and Klein and Pettis on the other side, and put the story inside a wider story. So Greta Krippner makes the point that during the Reagan administration, what was actually driving policy was a battle between the Federal Reserve under Volcker and the Reaganites. The Reaganites were funding a huge deficit. Volcker didn't like this. Volcker kept interest rates too high as a way of forcing them to close the deficit, but they didn't because they didn't care about the deficit. And there was a happy accident. The happy accident was that Japanese corporates who were earning 2% at home in JGBs could now buy American debt at 7%. And that's when they started funding our deficit. It was just an accident. So then you get to the Clinton period. And the Clinton period is an interesting one because Japan goes into recession. So the Japanese aren't buying the debt anymore. Now, let's jump forward a little bit to the end, to when the action happens in the Clinton period. What else is going on there is the East Asian financial crisis in 97. Yeah. And that prompts all the East Asian countries to start running a surplus against the rest of the world because they never want to go to the IMF again because it was horrible. So this brings me to the Klein and Pettis point, which is really about China, but is actually also about China running a surplus, East Asia running a surplus, and since 2012, Europe running a surplus. It's not that the Americans have to attract capital. Maybe in certain points they do. In this interregnum between when Japan stops buying and China starts buying, they might have a problem. And that seems to be where your story is. But the general condition is that when you have 2/3 of the world running a surplus, their surplus causes our deficits. This is the Klein and Pettis story, right? So rather than it being a problem of a US domestic savings, it's a problem of too much saving effectively in the surplus countries. They need to find somewhere to put it. That pushes up the demand for federal debt, pushes down the yield, and creates, if you will, your debts, right? So I'm just wondering if rather than it being an alternate story about US power, what you've done is identify what really went on in that period between the Japanese buying the debt and the Chinese buying the debt.
Should I respond?
Yeah, absolutely. Because nobody else has got their hand up.
Yeah, I think, look, there are, you mentioned two, well, first of all, regarding Volcker and Reagan, I have a somewhat different story there. I think that Reagan provides support to Volcker, but I don't want to get into this question now. It's not really important. But I think two elements that you mentioned that I didn't mention in my presentation is the East Asian crisis and China. There was the East Asian crisis and there was the Mexican crisis. And I think those two crises, in a way, especially the East Asian, they played a role in restoring the US financial leadership because the United States had to finance, to provide all the bailout. So in a way, it was back on the horse. It plays good for her, and it could be also, that the strong dollar policy was one of the causes of the crisis. I mean, this is another thing. It's we have to remember. Now, regarding China, this is I was surprised that in all the documents that I found, China is not mentioned as a threat.
Yeah.
At all.
At all.
China is mentioned in the list of the other Asian countries like Indonesia, Philippines, etc. It's a kind of underdeveloped country. There is no problem. And I think in a way, eventually like you are saying, that the United States didn't see it coming in terms of the threat from China. And regarding this, what you mentioned as, the surpluses that are looking investment, I think here we are as political economists, and I think economists also face the same problem because you have like a circle of causality and you don't know where it starts and what is the driving, you know what I mean? So you can basically reconstruct different stories based on the same findings, and it's very difficult, maybe impossible. I mean, I don't know if there is any way you can really distinguish and find what is the origin of the chain of causality. And I think in a way we have to accept that fact that we have like, a structure that perpetuate itself, and then there are certain events that cause a change in this structure. So, and yeah, I have to look more about the, like you said, it is a kind of the end of my story, what you mentioned with China, and I think this is a plausible suggestion.
Yeah, it just depends on how wide you want to make the parameters. It does strike me that there's two things going on in this story. So if you look at it as an internal coalitional battle, which I think is totally reasonable, there is a question as to why a democratic president would want to embrace a strong dollar policy if that's going to lead to deindustrialization. And he clearly did that. He must have thought that was a good idea, but why he would think that is an interesting question. But there is this kind of two bookends. One is Japan blows up, and then 8 years later, the East Asian crisis goes up. The other one as well, and you just may want to mention this, is that the reason the Bundesbank does what it does is because of reunification.
Yeah.
Right? It's, basically it jacks up interest rates to suck in capital from the rest of Europe. So in a way, what it's doing is it's playing its own game of the burden of adjustment. It is essentially saying the rest of Europe will suffer unemployment so that we can reintegrate Germany. So there's a double adjustment going on between it. That would be a nice way of phrasing it. So the Americans are like, we know that we need to cut interest rates, but if we do, we're kind of screwed. So we're not going to do that. We're going to screw our own people. The Germans look at it and go, we're going to raise interest rates, we're going to suck in all this money, and we're going to do that so we can deal with all these East Germans. And if that means the Brits have to suffer unemployment, then screw them. And that's a kind of like a nice double adjustment story there.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Colin, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Thanks, Mark. My question, as I posed in the chat, is the extent to which internal squabbles in America over who will benefit from monetary policy actually imply whether or not America is stronger or weaker internationally. So to what extent are those internal squabbles going to happen regardless of America's relative position? Because it appears to me, if I understood your argument correctly, you were implying that it was that would be somehow be influencing the extent to which those internal squabbles would happen.
Thank you.
The internal. So
if I can just I'll rephrase that. There's two things going on. To what extent are American policymakers really thinking about the international as a trade-off against the domestic, given the fact that the domestic trade-off is always there? Right? What is it about that moment that really makes this about we have to choose between the external and the internal? And how do we really know that they're making those types of choices? I think that's what the heart of what's Colin's getting at.
Yeah, and as at the beginning of my presentation, it was important for me to make this statement that I'm coming from the outside. So my intention is not to offer an alternative story to the internal explanation, but to offer an addition to the internal explanation based on the what was going on, because I think in many cases comparative political economists and sometimes even IPE scholars, they have this tendency to assume that things are started at the domestic level and they move to the external level. And what I wanted to say, okay, let's think the opposite. Let's start with the international level and see how the international level impact the domestic level. Now, you are right to ask this question because it is missing from my presentation. It's it's like I'm digging my way in, and this is certainly something that I have to do. I mean, obviously, the Wall Street benefited from the strong dollar policy. Obviously, they supported the strong dollar policy, but what I'm arguing is that I am not sure that this is enough to explain the strong dollar policy. What is, we also have to look on all these factors that I mentioned in my presentation, the developments of Europe, the unification of Germany, the Maastricht Treaty, the recession in Japan, and obviously and the rise of China at the beginning of the 2000s.
Yep, totally makes sense. Anyone else? There's actually only a couple of people on the call. Effort, Matthias, you want to come in? Go on, Matthias.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so my question is getting back to the issue of China, and I'm wondering what we can learn from your explanation in today's situation. Of course, the rise of China means we no longer have this unipolarity. We might still have the same conservative ideas in the US. So is it still possible for the US to keep the dollar strong, knowing that China will do whatever they can to weaken, if not the dollar, at least the US's ability to keep the dollar strong?
Yeah, I mean, you know, this is a point that I alluded to in the conclusion of my presentation. I think what we see during the Trump presidency, I mean, Trump was a backlash against the strong dollar policy and the other element of clintonism and neoliberalism. And the costs of maintaining I'm not arguing, you know, I have to be very carefully. I'm not arguing that the international role of the dollar is undermining, you know, I mean, this has to be, you know, very clear. But what I'm arguing is that, in a way, the international role of the dollar is not linked automatically to the power, to the capacity of the United States to use it to its own purpose. I mean, the dollar is in a way autonomous from the United States. So I think the role of the dollar it's going to be maintained for quite some time. But I think that the United States would find it more and more difficult to use its monetary power in order to get what it wants. And my story was an element in this process, a stage in this process of declining power. And, you know, if you're asking, you know, I don't want to get into speculation because, you know, things change so fast now. We still don't know what would be the impact of the crisis of Ukraine on the international financial system. We could see kind of, you know, division into two blocks. There are two moving particles to say anything meaningful about the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. We're just going to wrap it up now because I think that's basically all the questions we've got. But I've got just a couple of suggestions in closing. So what's really striking about this is and I'm old enough to remember this because I came to the United States in 1991. Oh, somebody's got their hand up. Who is it? You've got your hand up. Panelist, that's kind of weird. But anyway, I remember the whole strong dollar conversation, and it's just very interesting that no one uses that language now. And that really suggests that whatever was animating those concerns are not the things that are animating us now, right? So what was it about the strong dollar they were trying to signal back then? What was a strong dollar supposed to do, right? And then in terms of the anti-coalition, why was the strong dollar such a problem? And that, as you say, is the Fred Begg Stearns, we need to export more and blah, 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 and that sort of stuff. So I think there's just something very significant about that period that most people haven't tuned into. In terms of, you know, putting this forward as a paper, and I'll see you next week, but I'd be happy to talk about this again. I think it could be really cool if you actually just did a really straight comparison of double adjustments. That what you have is the United States has to do this internal-external trade-off, and the Germans have to do this external trade-off, and they end up making completely orthogonal choices, but they end up massively influencing each other because of it. And that could be a very nice framing for actually doing the whole thing.
You mean a kind of spontaneous coordinated system in a way?
Yeah, exactly, in the sense that they're both hit by shocks. One of them is that Japan stops buying your bonds because it blows up. So you now have to finance your external deficit. And the Germans suddenly have this huge problem because they now have to incorporate 17 million unemployed East Germans. And the easiest way to do that is to have an uber strong mark. Now they're going to take the hit because the real effective exchange rate goes up, which means their exports go down. But they get enough of capital inflows that they can finance reunification.
Mm-hmm.
So they're just making very different trade-offs on the same sort of metric. So that could be it. One question came in from YouTube, but it just said, how relevant is nationality in this? This may not be an issue at all. Coming sort of more from a David Harvey angle. So it's essentially, I guess the angle would be, if I were David Harvey and I was asking this, it would be the general neoliberalism argument. It's not about national interests. It's about a transnational or local class interest. Why would you go against that?
I don't get the question again. I mean, it's like a kind of class.
Yeah, I mean, the alternative to all of this is the sort of the David Harvey-esque question. Actually, another one just come up. Let me just check what's in here. Not sure I can build on that, but essentially, the alternative to this is that it's the sort of the standard neoliberal revolution story. That the strong dollar was just one front in an ongoing attempt of capital globally to restore profits after the long squeeze.
I would argue again. I think that any explanation, any other explanation that, you know, I don't reject automatically, because I kind of eclectic scholars. I don't find any need to defend one argument if I think that the combination of two approaches does a better job. But I think, again, what the puzzle here that any other explanation would have to address is the change in the US position, which was quite abrupt change in the early 90s, because to my mind, you know, as far as I know the literature, this is the argument regarding the declining power of the United States is the only explanation that can put the finger and explain why it happened at that point, because any other explanation would, in a way, would explain the continuity, because from the perspective of class struggle, no change has happened at that point. So this is basically the what I would argue.
Okay, sounds good. I'm willing to accept the argument. We are at time. Thank you for doing this, taking the time to do this. Thank you to everyone who's been on the call. I'll see you in a week for lunch. And for the rest of you, thanks very much for joining us. All the best.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.